This is Constitutional Rights in Black and White. The American criminal system is famous for its inequalities. Poor people are both more likely to encounter the criminal system and likely to be punished more heavily precisely because of their poverty. Less educated people are more likely to be criminalized. The system is well known for its racial disproportion and its heavy focus on people and communities of color. And the system affirmatively generates inequality because being punished makes everyone more vulnerable, poorer, less employable, and less healthy. This national picture of inequality, well documented as it is, has not fully accounted for municipal courts. Municipal courts have their own, sometimes unique, inegalitarian dynamics, some of them specific to the kinds of offenses that get adjudicated there, and some of them specific to the role that these courts play in local government. This video is taken from a webinar which explores more deeply the nature of inequality in municipal courts.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about our discussion and the terrific panel that we have to join us. I'll be introducing them shortly. My name is Lauren Studial. I'm on the faculty at Vanderbilt Law School. And the original title that our webinar was given for today was Municipal Courts as Potential Sites of Racial and Socioeconomic Disparity. I'll obviously be touching on that in this really brief introduction, but we added a subtitle in part because as a panel, we really want to take this time to not just highlight potential problems, but also lift up the positive work that courts are doing to identify and address disparities within their own systems and emphasize opportunities that exist for intervention and progress. As has already been touched on in other webinars in the series, if you've been fortunate to join, municipal courts are a regular part of so many people's daily lives. In many ways, we might think of them as at the bottom of the justice pyramid, not in terms of their importance, but in terms of their proximity to the people. However, as a result, that's also why socioeconomic and racial disparities are likely to show up here first. I think this quote sort of encompasses that idea well from the Salt Lake City Justice Court, saying, "We are painfully aware that municipal courts like ours have historically been situated on, or at least very near, the tip of systemic racism's spear." So, what are these disparities? Part of the issue is it's not totally clear. One of the problems with the way in which we've collected and can see data is that we don't have a really good picture of the national scene, right? We have little to no national municipal court data about the overall demographics of people who appear in municipal court, the number of people who don't have a lawyer, the dispositions or outcomes in these cases. And where data does exist, of course, individual courts might collect and analyze this data, but it's typically done on a case by or jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, making it difficult to obtain a broader systemic picture. There are certainly municipal court practices, including the imposition of fines and fees, that can disproportionately impact certain populations. And I know that one of our panelists will be touching on that. But I think it's also worth noting that other seemingly harmless policies, like advances in technology, can also have disproportionate impacts based on race or wealth. For example, if a court requires electronic filing of documents in all debt claims cases, and Black or poor communities within that jurisdiction are less likely than others to have access to broadband services, defendants from those communities may be less likely to respond to cases filed against them. Developing alternative approaches, in this case, perhaps providing access to the electronic filing platform at a public library, or providing alternatives to electronic filing, not only level the playing field for those who've been systematically disadvantaged, but also likely provide needed assistance across the board. I know that introduction was fairly brief and obviously at a very high level, but I think the real substance and excitement of our panel today is our panelists, who I'll now introduce, who will really be enriching our discussion with many more specifics of their work on the ground. Um, so first we have Dylan Hare. Dylan is the National Advocacy and Campaigns Director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center. Next, we have Rochelle Pride, who's the Interim Director of Economic Development and Planning and the Director of the Office of Justice Policy and Programs and the Court-Appointed Special Advocates in Franklin County, Ohio. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Puente, who's the Director of the Utah Judiciary's Office of Fairness and Accountability.
This work in Utah, began in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. Our judicial council felt that as many jurisdictions were releasing statements, they felt they needed to do more, so they started this office. Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that folks are treated fairly and with respect, regardless of factors such as race, gender, ethnicity, disability, and economic status, like religion, sexual orientation, or marital status, veteran status. Again, we want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and with respect when they come to the courts. I'll give you one data point, or a couple of data points. For example, the Black population in the state of Utah is like 1.8%. However, in our jails and prisons, that percentage point jumps to 8%. Latinos, and in the state it's about 20% of the population. However, in jails and prisons, our representation is about 35%. So there's a significant disparity. So we knew that there were significant issues. So to guide this project, we formed a work group to identify items or cases within our justice courts. That's what we call our municipal courts here in the state of Utah. Within our justice courts, that may create this these disparities. So we identify certain case types, from driving without a license to driving without proof of insurance, driving under the influence, trespass, possession of controlled substance. And once we identify those cases, what we then want to do is measure the following: charging decisions, pretrial release decisions, plea bargaining by prosecution, sentencing decisions, and recommendations from probation. Again, we want to really measure as much as possible, what causes those disparities. We recognize here in Utah that the justice courts or municipal courts, they are, the start or the part of the judicial branch that the public has most contact with. So we want to address these issues, because without addressing these issues, we really impact our trust and confidence with the public. And without that public trust and confidence, we lose legitimacy.
Franklin County has been very intentional in our work for now over the past decade in addressing a lot of the racial and socioeconomic disparities that we know individuals who encounter the justice system face. But I would go further enough to say that we were probably a decade too late. We understand that there are intergenerational impacts when we know that disproportionate minority contact becomes a real thing over and over again within our systems. We work to really identify, especially at the height and in the midst of the pandemic, a framework that helped us, one, acknowledge that racism is a root cause of poverty, bad health, broken families, and damaged communities, and that we understood that this also leads to over-incarceration and those individuals who, of course, are impacted by being underserved. We looked at why is there racial disparities in persons who commit and are charged with offenses of this type. We looked at how are these decisions being made by our justice authorities, from law enforcement to prosecution to court probation. So our municipal court actually during the pandemic assisted our county in literally flipping the face of our jail. The profile of our jail completely changed to where we were able to look at cases very intentionally and understand that those who were in jail that did not need to be there or cases could be handled in an alternative manner needed the access to be able to do so.
Poverty and money are old challenges for the criminal system, and they have constitutional implications. In 1983, the Supreme Court held in Bearden versus Georgia that courts cannot automatically lock people up just because they can't pay a fine. That would violate the Equal Protection Clause. Rather, courts must hold hearings to inquire into the reasons for non-payment. As the Supreme Court explained, the state cannot impose a fine as a sentence and then automatically convert it into a jail term solely because the defendant is indigent and cannot pay the fine in full. But in practice, Bearden is routinely ignored. Thousands of people are incarcerated every year without that hearing, and solely because they cannot afford to pay a fine.
I'd like to take us back to 2015. 10 years ago, in what's commonly known as the Ferguson Report, the Department of Justice wrote this: the Ferguson Municipal Court handles most charges brought by the Ferguson Police Department and does so not with the primary goal of administering justice or protecting the rights of the accused, but of maximizing revenue. There are two reasons to go back to this report. First, as groundbreaking as it was, for Black people who lived in Ferguson, the report wasn't anything new. It reaffirmed what they had been experiencing and talking about for years. And the second reason to revisit this report: Ferguson was not and is not unique. Municipal courts exist across the country. For millions of people, a local municipal court is their only place to seek justice, and it's the institution communities are forced to trust to administer justice fairly. But in many jurisdictions, municipal courts serve one purpose above all else. It's not to resolve harm or to put people on a path toward healing and redemption. Regardless of stated purpose or the best intent of people who work in those courts, the practical reality is often this: municipal court's job is to generate revenue for local government. Even if it feels like you're solving local problems with the local court, the perverse systemic incentives around revenue force courts to extract resources from people to compensate local government for the budget holes they're not willing to fill in other ways. Fees are prolific and can compound quickly. Police are turned into armed debt collectors, and courts use tools like suspending someone's license to punish them because they cannot afford to pay fines and fees, or to somehow coerce payment from them even though they can't afford it. Additionally, they incentivize net widening. If they're seen as generating needed revenue through the proliferation of fines, fees, and debt-based consequences and arrests, well, when you need more revenue, what else do you think you're going to get more of? Because here's what's really happening. If you're trapped in a cycle of debt in your municipal court, you can't buy groceries for your kids because you owe thousands of dollars in fines. You can't afford rent this month because you have to pay fees, or face the risk of having a warrant issued for your arrest and police knock down your door. You can't call police when you're the victim of harm because you know you owe fines or fees, and it's more likely they come to collect from you instead of check on you. I'm not naive to the fact that slashing whatever revenue a municipal court may generate could lead to some difficult decisions about your budget. Make those decisions in partnership with the people whose lives have been shaped by that municipal court.
So we've heard about some really positive, proactive things being done in the courts to address, right, what may be some current disparities. And we've also heard Dylan talk about sort of how revenue generation is intimately tied up with a lot of what municipal courts do. So given that, I guess the question from our audience member is anyone working on, or what do you think of the argument that we should actually just shrink the footprint of these courts, right, in addition to trying to improve what they do, perhaps in part because they are inherently tied up with, right, mass criminalization and these inequities?
As we are a community that right now, we are the only jurisdiction in the country that has shut down a jail to then demolish it and then build an early learning center. That's how deep that we're going in our efforts to say that preschool to prison pipeline that we talked about for so many decades, we have to intentionally and actively eradicate it by taking away physical structures, physical capacity. And even as we have a new jail that's online, we are still capped at how many beds we're willing to build. Franklin County is the largest county in the state of Ohio. It is made up of about upwards of 1.3 million people and counting. And our growth and what's anticipated in the next 10 to 15 years is astronomical, right? However, we do not want to build to that capacity or put people into a criminalized situation based on that capacity. We want to continue to move the needle in not having to criminalize people in order to help them. And so with our municipal court, we recently launched at the end of last year our tap-in center, which is a warrant misdemeanor nonviolent warrant recall program that is in the community that meets our residents where they are to allow them to address their legal matters with dignity, with respect, and with a humanized approach to the things that are necessary for their next step to truly be the best step. And so we incorporated wraparound services in there, but our municipal court, our clerk's office, the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, license reinstatement, everything that a person would need that finds themselves in a situation like having that minor misdemeanor warrant that is nonviolent.
So there's actually, I'll go back to the Ferguson report. There's a lot of this sort of stuff in there, but there's this quote from an email, I guess, that was sent from a finance director to the city manager. And he says, the finance director says, court fees are anticipated to rise about 7.5%. I asked the chief of police if he thought he could deliver a 10% increase. He said he would try. Do you really in your heart of hearts believe that the chief of police wants that to be his job for the next year? Right? Do you think that that's what cops wanted to do when they were dreaming of being cops when they were young kids, is being armed debt collectors, right? And going around the community and basically knocking down doors to raise money for the city? Even if you don't agree with us that there are sort of moral, values-based, sort of human-centered reasons to sort of do these refinements and reforms, if you're a law enforcement champion as a state legislator, you're putting your law enforcement in a really bad spot by forcing them to go do this every day. But there's also, if that is not compelling for you, or if you're sort of, you have different sort of goals as a legislator or policymaker or politically speaking, whatever, there's also arguments around system efficacy. Across the country, you are spending more than you are ever collecting when you're relying on fines and fees for revenue. And so to the extent that municipal courts are sort of perpetuating that, the state's probably losing more than it's ever bringing back.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. I really wish we had more time to learn from all of you, but thank you for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge with us.